And we start with Elisa Bellotti from the University of Manchester, who is going to present on qualitative methods, network boundaries. And no, the title is changed. Qualitative methods and legal mechanisms in network research.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I had to drop the network boundaries eventually because I didn't really have time to sort it out as well. So what I'm presenting today, first of all, I'm Elisa Bellotti from the Mitchell Center of Social Network Analysis at the University of Manchester. What I'm presenting today are some bits and bobs of material that is coming out in my book, which is finally coming out in August, and I even got flyers of that. So I'm very happy about it. And so the idea behind this presentation is that obviously, as you might know, doing mixed methods, normally we talk about a battlefield. So we are used to talk about this qualitative and quantitative divide in terms of incompatible paradigms, where we have ontological and epistemological assumptions, and we assume, well, we might not, but normally people assume that they are incompatible in terms of what we are, the substance of the empirical reality, the ways in which we observe it. The thing is that what is being called the paradigm war has always been in social sciences. So it did develop out of social sciences, and it's never been in other sciences. So you would never hear astrophysics, for example, saying oh well, there is a quantitative, qualitative, although they use observations, for example, and then they quantify these observations. Or geologists, for example, they can't really do experiments with rocks. Anyway, so the idea behind the presentation is that maybe it's time that we historically reframed this opposition, and we don't talk about incompatible paradigms, but we look at a qualitative reaction against structural functionalism and the dominance of inferential statistics. So if we look at the qualitative methods as a way in which people reacted to a specific dominance of a specific type of quantitative methods, maybe we can overcome this incompatible position. So it all began in the 70s. So this is a quote from Clyde Mitchell, and he says, popularity of social network analysis seems to have two different origins. The first arrives from a growing dissatisfaction with structural functional analysis. The second is the development of non-quantitative mathematical ways of rigorously stating implication entailing a set of relationship among a number of persons. And Harrison White saying categorical description of social structure have no solid theoretical grounding. So if we look at the origins of network analysis, they were actually embedded in the same reaction against the dominance of inferential statistics. So in a sense, social network analysis is not that far away from qualitative methods in their approach toward quantitative methods. So where is the problem? So what is exactly that we're battling against? Well, categorical analysis or quantitative methods are based on inferential statistics. So the idea is that you've got empirical results that are used to reach conclusions that extend beyond the data. So you collect data on a sample and then you infer properties from the sample to the population. So where is the problem? Well, they assume a general linear model. I don't normally use formulas, but this time I do have a formula, and I actually can read it. So the problem is that the inferential statistics use a general linear model where you have a dependent variable, epsilon, and then you normally have a set of variables and some measurement errors, but in empirical settings, observations are not independent from each other, which is one of the assumptions of network analysis. So we do have a problem in the error. The errors are not independent, but they are actually autocorrelated, which is the basic of network analysis. And also, normally in empirical settings, it's normally very difficult to establish a priori the type and number of variables, so the P's, that should be included in the model. So when you don't know what you're looking at, then it's very difficult to define the P's in advance. And in empirical settings, normally when you do statistical analysis, you drop the outliers because they don't fit in your model. But actually, outliers are normally very interesting cases. So unless it's a measurement error, so you actually made a mistake in collecting or coding your data, outliers normally indicate there are different mechanisms in place. And therefore, it's quite difficult to assume homogeneity across groups. So, some implications of these observations that empirical settings are actually open systems where regularities are rare because of the effects of dependencies. People influence each other and therefore they change all the time. Concurrent variables are too complex to be modeled most of the time. And inference is only possible in closed systems. So it's only when we can keep everything under control that we can actually use inferential statistics. But in open systems, that's very difficult to do. And the implication for social network analysis is that, of course, you can use statistical models, but the network models are excellent when we know who the actors are. So we already know in advance where are the boundaries of our networks, and we actually collect data for all these people. We collect information of everyone who belongs to the network, so we don't have missing data, although now we do have some techniques to deal with missing data, but that's a very groundbreaking piece of research. And we assume that certain mechanisms, for example, homophilia, reciprocity, transitivity, have certain meanings, and more important, that they are equally spread around across the network. So, for example, ERGM models assume that a mechanism is equally distributed around the network. It acts everywhere in that network. And so it doesn't allow a network to have different mechanisms in place in different areas of these networks. So what's happening in open system? Well, normally actually when we collect our own data, we look at boundaries and they're very fuzzy. So they're transient, they're dynamic, and it's difficult to be set for both the actors and the observers. So it's not only that we might not have access to the observation of the boundaries, but sometimes actors don't know if there are boundaries around them. We often cannot reach the complete population of a network because we don't know the boundaries, or because actors might not be available for research. You might spot them, but that doesn't mean that they're going to participate. And normally, what we find is that there are intransitive mechanisms. So there are mechanisms that might act underneath actors' perceptions. They might be multiple and concurrent, and they might produce different outcomes in different contexts. So we can think about mechanism as M's. So we might have different mechanisms, and depending on specific context, they might give a specific output. So qualitative methods can offer some help in all of them, I would say, but I'm going to focus on the third point here, the mechanisms. So the empirical material that I'm presenting here are 3 different research projects that I've been involved in. The first one is the ethnographic study of 2 informal street groups living in a deprived suburb of Milan. And I used moderate and fully participant observation, unstructured interviews, in-depth interviews, and a focus group with the gangs. And the project was a qualitative stepwise circular research design, which means that I gain some data, I formulated some hypotheses, I test them on data, then I got new hypotheses, I went on again, collect more data, and so on and so forth. And then I had to stop because I had to hand in my dissertation. And the second study is a study of friendship ego networks of 23 single male and female people, again collected in Milan. I'm from Milan, that's why all the data are from Milan. I use name generator, the classic name generator, and in-depth interviews. And here it's a parallel mixed method research design, so social network analysis and qualitative are equivalent, so I collect both the network structure and the interviews simultaneously, and I use them both in data collection and analysis. So I compare the cases and produce some typologies. And the last project is a project on research collaboration in philosophy in Italy over 10 years. Data were collected using archives, so obviously it was qualitative material first of all. It's a sequential mixed method research design because I collected this data, I ran some quantitative analysis first, And then based on the results of the quantitative analysis, then I went on to do some content analysis on the archives. So how do we contextualize mechanisms? What I'm going to talk about is homophily. Okay, so in the first case study, the strict groups. So I've got these two groups that are called alpha and thetas, and they are both very similar. So they're all composed by male people. They're all aged between 14 and 21. They're all organized in a similar way. So they have a clique of close friends, and then a few other kids hanging around them. And they're all from the south of Italy. And they also share similar activities. So they used to consume a lot of drugs. They were in charge of dealing drugs, so they used to have their points, meeting points called the piazza in Italian, and they used to sell drugs there. And the access to these illegal activities were granted by connections to adult wars. So obviously there were older people providing the drugs, and normally they were involved in organized crime. So in this case, what the kids used to do was to display the similarities across the group. So the homophily was displayed. So when they were inside the piazza, they were just hanging around, but every time I followed them outside the piazza, they always used to find a way to display their belonging as a group. So for example, they were grouping together, or they were adopting some recognizable items, so sometimes they were all wearing the same color, or they were all wearing sunglasses. But obviously, because they were displaying their belonging and they were becoming visible, they also attract attention and get marginalized. So this is a focus group. So they say, like, when you go clubbing in Milan, you have to be well dressed, smart, with a jacket. They work with a specific kind of people. So I asked, are you not part of these people? And they said, like, we're not. We don't even like to be. Well, it's not that we wouldn't like to. We dress up, but they still come out with excuses, and then they don't let us in the club. So what you do then? And they said, well, most of the time we leave, but sometimes when they really piss us off, it might end up in fights. So what happens is that they go in front of the club, they group all together, they're all made, they're all dressed up in the same way. They become very recognizable. The bouncers normally reject them, and therefore they ended up in a fight. And they always ended up in a fight when I was there, basically. And so obviously they displayed the homophily, but at the same time, this display act against them and marginalize them further. So the second example is a case study of the friendship network, where, again, we've got a homophily in place. So here, homophily it acts as a constraint for this person. So this is Giovanna's network. Giovanna is an ego network, and there is ego somewhere there. And basically, Giovanna grew up, she's Jewish, and she grew up in a Jewish community, and she, obviously, like, the fact that she grew up in the Jewish community means that her ego network is highly dense, everybody know each other. And she described it in this way. So she says, I'm Jewish, and I made the mistake to go to the local Jewish school from the age of 3 to 19. As a result, I have strong friendship ties that last since I was a child. But on the other side, being always in the same environment is not positive. It's hard to grow up because people have known me since I was a child, and it's difficult to change. I could not stand it anymore, I could not change, I could not show people that I was a different person, that I grew up. I had this stereotypical image attached, and she really struggled with changing her identity, because everybody's so embedded and they all share the same cultural background. So it's very homophilous. They come from the same community, but because it's very homophilous, then it doesn't allow any change. And the third example is the research collaboration. So here basically I've got people collaborating to research projects, and people belong to disciplines. So I calculated the EI index for philosophy disciplines, and as you can see, all the EI index are very positive, which means that there is a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration. So the mechanism in place here is a mechanism of heterophily. People tend to collaborate with people different from them. So here you do some quantitative analysis. So the dependent variable is the amount of money that these people gain over 10 years. And then you throw in some variables, so for example, the rank of these people, if they are professors, associates, the discipline they work in, and then you have some network measures out. So we've got the heterophilus EI index, but it doesn't come out significant, so it doesn't explain success. And there are other intervening mechanisms like brokerage roles and density, which explain much more the amount of money that these people gain. So what I did here was then look at the description. So these are research projects, so you download the description of the project, and people have to use narratives to praise for the money. So they have to say like, oh, you should fund us because we are brilliant, blah, blah, blah. And so what I found here is the homophily mismatch. So they always, for example, they always talk about density and they say like, oh, you should fund us because we've already collaborated in the past, we were successful in the past, so please fund us again. They never talk about brokerage, for example, so nobody says like, I collaborate with different groups and I tend to move a lot, so therefore you should fund me. But what is interesting here in this case is that they always use interdisciplinarity as a way for asking for money. So they say like, we are very interdisciplinary, we work on different projects, blah, blah, blah. And the way in which I did it, I literally read through these 200 and blah projects, and I coded all these narratives that they use. And then I counted the number of times that themes come out. And then I use network analysis to visualize that. So the nodes here are the topics, and the ties are the number of times that two topics come out together in a project. And if you high up the strength of the tie, so up to 10 projects in common, you have quite dense network of concepts where there is broker, there is where has a broker is not that they talk about brokers, the fact that there is a broker in the project, but they never talk about brokers. The interdisciplinarity is there, linking different philosophical traditions is there. And when you rise up the number of projects up to 40, you see that interdisciplinarity is now out. So interdisciplinarity, I think, is still there, up to 20, but it's like in the periphery there, up to 30, and it's completely out, up to 40, while having a broker is there, and linking different philosophical projects is there. So obviously, like, they use the idea of interdisciplinarity, and it's very common in the projects, but it's actually not a successful strategy. So, just to conclude very briefly, so the idea qualitative methods can help us in studying networks in open systems. So we can understand the underlying mechanism, we can detect the co-occurrence of mechanism, brokerage together with homophily or density, especially when we don't know in advance which are these mechanisms. And we can check if people are aware of this mechanism because we can ask them, or we can read. And further areas that need to be explored, that I did talk about in the book, is like how we can use qualitative methods to define boundaries and dealing with missing data, but now I think I've run out of time, so that's it. And that's the book. So there are flyers, and if you have forgot the flyer, you get a discount. So that's it, thanks.
So thank you very much, Elisa, for your presentation. Very interesting. So questions? No questions? Yes, one over there.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Jordan Brennan from Imperial College. I'm quite new to social network analysis, and I was just interested, and I might have misunderstood your presentation, but when you talked about the assumption that homophily, reciprocity, etc. has the same meaning in every context and in every relationship in the network from a quantitative perspective, your discussion of the different cases looking at the impacts or implications of homophily in the street group versus the friendship network, were you trying to allude to the fact that these concepts can mean different things in different contexts? Or if you could tell me a bit more about that, I'd be really interested.
Are there any other questions before I give the floor back to the presenter? Yeah.
Hi, Gemma from Manchester as well. Yeah, you didn't have a chance to say much about how qualitative methods might help us to define network boundaries, but if I could take this opportunity to ask you to say a couple of words about that, would be really interesting.
Thank you. Okay.
Right, thanks. So, first question, yes, that's exactly what I mean. The thing is that, like, when you do statistical analysis, like with ERGM models, for example, what they do is that they look at some basic microstructure, like the presence of triads or reciprocity or transitivity, and they look at their distribution in the network and they see if they're distributed more or less than how they would distribute it by chance, in nutshell, and I'm not an expert. But the point is that, like, they expect that the distribution of these things are the same across the entire network. So you cannot have a network where a part of it is more triadic and a part of it is more reciprocal and a part of it is more homophilous. So you need to have the same. It can be, you know, it can be more or less than by chance, but you assume that there is the same mechanism in place when you analyze these kind of networks, which is, it makes sense and it's relatively expectable when you have small networks, for example, like in a classroom. But when you start looking at really large networks, then that's where, for example, these methods fail to a certain extent to be applied. But also from a qualitative point of view, you might look at homophily and we might measure homophily and say, like, well, you know, we relate to people very similar to us. But what does it mean for the people involved in this network might be different. So in some cases it might be useful, in some cases it might be not useful. In some cases we might think that we are not that homophilous, but we actually are, or vice versa. So that's for the first question. For the second question, well, detecting the boundaries. So for example, like in the first case, well, in the third case with the research collaboration, it was relatively easy in a sense that, you know, when you use archival research, you're kind of limited by the fact that that's the material. And as Nick was saying, you can't just go back and say, like, can I have, you know, you can't interview these people. Well, I could have interviewed them, but, you know, like, these are the projects that were funded. So that were my boundaries. Obviously, I don't have information about the unsuccessful bids, for example. So I can't compare the unsuccessful with the successful, which is a limit of my research. But it's a limit in the fact that the data are not available. In the friendship networks, for example, the name generator that I used wasn't limited. So I asked the people to name all the friends that they wanted to name, regardless of the meaning of friendship. And then I asked them to discuss what they meant and why they involved some people and some others were only, you know, not in the network but only in the interviews, for example. And in the first case, using observation is very useful because obviously, like, when I started with these groups, it took me a while to observe, first of all, to obviously gather access to these kind of illegal gangs, but also you start observing them and you think, like, okay, well, these are the people that seems to be here all the time. But then you follow, you shadow people and you shadow relationships around, and then you realize that they also have connections between gangs. So they were all connected to each other, they were all connected to some adult people, they had certain kind of relationship with some type of adult. So they were very successful in the criminal world, for example, not very successful in the legal world, like in school or work. So in a sense, it's, you know, the qualitative methods, especially observations, allow you to be flexible in the boundaries, because obviously, like, you can observe different levels, so the gang level and the overlapping networks of different gangs, and then different multi-level networks where they are embedded in with, you know, adult people or other areas, which is something that when you collect data quantitatively, you normally can't really do that. So.
And now move on to our second presentation, also from University of Manchester, and it's Bruce Edmonds with, so I hope the title hasn't changed, using agent-based simulation to integrate micro-qualitative evidence, macro-quantitative data, and network analysis.
Thank you, from the Manchester Metropolitan University, one of the other universities in Manchester. Okay. Some of this work is certainly the bit I'm going to illustrate with this work comes from a large project called the SCID project, Social Complexity of Immigration and Diversity, which is done with 2 departments in the University of Manchester and many names. But just putting up that. So mixed method research has a number of very well-known problems. Okay, I've always been an advocate of mixed methods research. But that doesn't mean that it's easy at all. Okay? So particularly, it's very difficult to tell if your qualitative and quantitative elements are consistent with each other. If you have a model that comes out of your work, and it doesn't work quite, it doesn't seem to explain things, it's very difficult to tell which bit is wrong. Okay. So there are a number of problems, and I'm trying to look for ways out. I'm trying to put mixed methods onto a slightly clearer framework, and I've developed some personal guiding principles. And of course, the first one, I guess you'll all agree with. In science, one should not ignore evidence without a very, very, very good reason. Okay? If you're deliberately ignoring evidence, either quantitative or qualitative, you're not being scientific. Secondly, though, in any model you produce, even if it's an analogical model in pictures or words, you should try and keep as clear as possible what the bits of your model are referring to. Okay? A lot of models, especially when you look at some of the sort of linear models that have been criticized in some of the papers here, it's really unclear what some of these variables or averages or constructs stand for. It is some fudge that seems to cover a wide variety of cases. And here, I think, in some of the papers, we're actually quite clear what comes from what participants are saying, what they're meaning in a very specific context, in a with very specific words and symbols. Thirdly, the more drastic, or if you want to be polite, heroic, the abstraction, the more the resulting model needs validating. So if you've got something that's supposed to be a theory that covers all social networks, or immigration across lots of different countries or something like that, then it probably needs a lot more validation than something where you've gone into a particular case study and you talk to the people and you've actually found out what has happened. And finally, of course, the modelling choices and steps should be as transparent and as replicable as possible, so other people can follow what you've done and understood what you've done and maybe give a different interpretation to it. Okay, looking for the reasons for it. So I'm probably going to fail on some of these, but this is my attempt at succeeding them. Okay. So the basic idea in this is to stage abstraction instead of doing it in one leap, to do it in lots of more careful leaps. So we might have a lot of micro evidence about how people behave, and maybe some macro data about corresponding things that happen at the macro level. And basically our technique is to make a quite complicated simulation model, what I call a DIM, a data integration model, that tries to produce a coherent picture of all of this evidence put together. This is not a general theory, it's a very specific description, just happens to be in a computer. You then might abstract further from that, making models of the model, and maybe you might draw a network model coming out of that. We'll talk more about some of these bits. Of course, macro data tends to be quantitative. Micro evidence can be very qualitative. And we should be drawing on that wealth of qualitative information to inform our models. And up to now, on the whole, formal modelers haven't been able to cope with qualitative data. They just don't know what to do with it. And of course, this is increasing abstraction. And maybe in this model, a social network model happens at the top as a quite an abstract outcome rather than as evidence in. So there's a different use. So these data integration models, the one second from the bottom, are a particular kind of agent-based simulation. You may be aware that there are some simple abstract simulation models out there, evolution of cooperation, prisoner dilemmas, stuff like that. There's supposed to be a theory that explains a lot. This is the opposite end of the spectrum. Okay? So this is intended more as a computational description of a particular case rather than a general theory. And we aim to represent as much of the relevant evidence as possible in one coherent and dynamic simulation. And this provides a target for abstraction, data abstraction. And quite importantly, I think for me, it separates two steps. Representation, I'll go back here. So here we're trying to really struggle with how we represent all of this data into a single coherent, and the abstraction comes at a different stage. Most work you have to do representation and abstraction all in one step. Here we're at least trying to separate those. Okay, well, I'm going to talk a brief bit about agent-based simulation because I'm not sure how many people know about it or understand it. They've probably heard of it. It's a kind of computer simulation, sort of serious Sims. Have you ever played Sims? This is a serious version of it, where the individual social actors and their interactions are represented separately, as separate bits of the computer. They're not generalized, they're all kept track of separately in the computer. Okay? And this allows a heterogeneity of actors in terms of their characteristics, their behaviors, different situations in the way they might be behaving differently in different situations. So what happens is not centrally determined, but rather emerges from all the interactions of all these bits. And there's nothing stopping you from putting both top-down constraints, social norms, laws, coming from the top down in these simulations, as bottom-up emergence. So you can have both of these directions simultaneously. Just to draw a picture of the sort of thing that might happen, you will start with a number of agents in your simulation, and you will sort of program in some level of rules or behavior. In this case, as we'll see, perhaps partially informed by qualitative information. And then you set it going, and they interact with each other. And this just keeps going, okay? And that's your simulation. And your conclusions come from some representation of the outcomes of that simulation. And that's quite an important step of this technique, and is often assumed that this is trivial and there's no actual modelling work being done here, but that's not the case. So the aims and the objective of this complex simulation is to develop, okay, I've said that, regardless of how complex this makes it. And this can really end up in quite a complex, slow model that we don't fully understand. It's more of a description and representative than a theory. Now, one of the things I'm working on, one of my personal projects, is how to use narrative data, this rich amount of narrative data, to inform these behavioural rules within these simulations. And that sort of imports some of the mess that we observe in society, the untidiness, the complications, the context dependency of people, the idiosyncrasies of people into these simulations, rather than, up to now, what we've tended to get is quite neat constructions. You get these little neat constructions, they're more like a sort of engineering work of art than a representation of anything we see out there. Okay? This is the opposite end of the spectrum. So they're very complicated to understand. In fact, we don't understand the simulations completely, which is why you need further abstraction steps to analyze the simulation. The principal way we've used up to now to extract, for example, from narrative data is to provide a menu of possible behaviours or strategies that you might program in. So by interviewing or talking, observing people, you can see the sort of strategies they use. And they're often quite mundane. I say, what do you do? Well, I try this out. If it doesn't work, I ask my friend. And if that doesn't work, I put it to the bottom of the in-train. Ignore it, or whatever they do. They seem quite simple strategies, but the context in which they're applied is often quite sophisticated. So although each of the rules seem simple to program in, the conditions of application of when that agent would use that rule is often much more tricky. And then, of course, part of this, if you're using it particularly in a participatory role, is then to show the results back to the stakeholders and people who are involved. So you animate it and show it in various ways and try and get feedback from people about why the simulation is working or when it's not working, or under what circumstances it doesn't do what they would expect it to. And of course, finally, you can just extract any measures from these simulations you want, measuring it in a similar way to surveys and stuff like that to get the answers out. Okay, so in this particular project, we reviewed the literature and we extracted a whole lot of causal stories. The sort of folklore in this project is there are 54 of them, but I have no idea whether that's right, okay? So we started off with 54 causal stories, sort of things like we're trying to look at why people bother to vote, out of a feeling of civic duty, due to sheer habit, interest in politics, etc., etc. So some of these were theoretical. This one was suggested by the literature, unsurprisingly. Okay, that you actually re-evaluate the past performance when you voted and did it help? I can't imagine anyone actually doing that, okay, but that's came from the literature as a possible story. There was a very small qualitative survey done where we stopped people and asking them at the doorway of voting why they were voting or why they bothered to vote. And that certainly confirmed some of these, like feeling of civic duty or dragging out a member of household with you to vote. Right, so the whole structure of the model, once it was built, was a very complicated model. So there were whole underlying data from the BS British Household Panel Survey to set up the model. There were a whole lot of demographics of people dying, or being born, forming partnerships, moving, etc. The social network and formation and maintenance happened on top of that, making friends through school, through work, through friends of friends. The influence happened by those social networks, and the voting behaviour came out of that. So it is I'm not going to go through this model, but it is quite complex. There's a picture of that. So each square is a household with the different agents in it. You can see some of the social networks of the different kinds stretching across that. Each agent will have different attributes: class, activity, age, ethnicity, level of political interest, etc. And a memory of past events, like who we talked to and who I voted for, all sorts of things like that. So it's not a simple model at all. Sorry. Okay. I tend to talk too fast. Okay, so one way, of course, is to then do experiments with this and try and find some indications of what's happening in the model in a purely quantitative way. So here, a certain voter mobilization was added in, whereby political parties talk to random people and try to persuade them to vote. And you can see some of the outcome in terms of civic norms, lasting a bit longer than the intervention, as well as habit. And in our models, it is these two, civic duty and habit, comes out again and again as more important. But of course, you can also output the social network. So here's the social network in this simulation of 1950 of the model. This is not people. And the majority population are in blue, long-standing ethnicities. The established immigrants are in green, and some of the new immigrants are in red. And in the model, you can see some of the structure that we might expect if we did the social network of certain people. By 2010, in the simulation, you get a lot more mixing. There are less isolated groups. It's more integrated, but there's still a difference. There's still two broad clusters, but there's no segregation. As well as these sort of numerical and network, we also can output pseudo narratives out of the simulation. So what you do is you pick a random agent and you follow through and see what happens to it. To try and get a pseudo story out of the simulation. Why is this useful? Well, if you're with a bit more editing to be a bit more readable, you can then present these stories to experts, to stakeholders, and say, is this likely to happen? Would these stories actually happen? If not, what would intervene? What would stop it happening? So it can be used as a probe for eliciting further information. One of the advantages of this technique is that it tries to retain the reference in each of these models to the maximum extent. So in the social network model, it was absolutely clear what constituted a link, because that model was of a simulation, where you could define what the link was and check it against that simulation. The detailed behavior in the simulation model was mapped against specific evidence and data that's found there. So at each stage down the abstraction layer, you know what things mean, and the minimum of sort of invented entities, which you tend to get in an abstract model, can occur. If you had to go straight to a social network model from the evidence, you'd probably have to invent a lot of things. You'd probably have to rely upon maybe the interpretation that people are asking for, what they mean by a political relationship where they would discuss things. And you get a lot of variety in that, or you'd have to invent it, look at your phone records or something like that. This way, by staging the abstraction, the abstraction happens a little bit more gently. Now, of course, in this project, the theoretical physicists are doing most of the top stuff, and the social scientists are doing most of the bottom stuff, and I am the sort of interface in between, which, given that my father was a physicist and my mother was a social worker, is probably correct. Okay. One of the other aspects of this I'm very interested in is it preserves somewhat the context dependency of action. Because in the simulation, decisions, communication, and learning take place within its own local context, within its own social network, each of these agents. They're not obeying generic rules or tendencies. The whole thing comes out to the locality of it. So it's a technique that actually allows us to implement social embeddedness within a formal model. Perhaps the first technique that allows you to do that in behavior, going right from the micro level of behavior to the macro level structure, something out of that. Okay. So one of my bugbears is the fact that a lot of social scientists don't talk about context itself. They either assume a context, and then you work within that context and find out what people are thinking and doing within that context, or, on the other extreme, you assume that context doesn't matter at all. I'm only studying what behavior is true across all contexts. And you'll talk to some social scientists, and they say that. Rather than trying to actually separate out what the contexts are and how that makes a difference to social behavior. And if we're going to get a picture of complex social action, then I think we're going to have to grab that network. We're going to have to say, look, people do act in different contexts, and we need to include that in our description. Okay, so in a sense, this methodology fixes several of the known weaknesses of social network models. The definition of links is clear. The machinery of the social networks as static objects don't explain why they change so much, but the underlying social simulation does. The validation of social network models is often weak. You produce a social network model, and it looks plausible, but there's no independent check on it. But you can have multiple checks on this simulation model from which these social networks are extracted. Network measures are often used as if they're known that they give reliable indicators. We use centrality. Now, that must have picked the right ones. But we don't know in any particular case, for this particular kind of network, whether centrality would work. It's a theoretical construct. By having a layer where you can debug and look down below in the simulation, you can actually start to check the mechanisms and see whether in the simulation it was performing a central role, and whether that abstraction to the social network level is justified. Conclusions. Complex agent-based models, I think, are a good vehicle for integrating types of data rather than making high theory, in my view. And particularly, qualitative data can be very useful for that. Obviously, I'm keen in staging abstraction into more gentle steps. This does take a lot more time and work, but I think actually we might have a more meaningful set of constructs. You get a whole chain of models rather than a single model as a result of that. And I think that represents our multi-abstraction level of understanding of society. We do understand society from the personal to the quite abstract. Yes? I think that's it. I've already sent the slides in advance. You can get the slides there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So are there any questions? Yes.
Thank you. Elisa, I've been Middlesex University. Thank you very much. That was very interesting, although I have still quite a difficulty to grasp it, obviously. I was wondering, using the example that you used, actually, the voting behavior, and thinking of this kind of gradient in level of abstraction, so we can take into consideration both the qual and the quant. Using that particular example, could you tell me how you managed the context and the historicity factor at the meso level of analysis?
The meta level?
Meso.
Meso level, okay.
Just second, are there any other questions? Okay, so I'll...
Which is a huge question. The historicity is quite difficult because the simulation has to start somewhere, and you're really stuck at that because of the limitations. So there are two responses to that. One is you try and initialize it in as a realistic way as possible. So by using, we plucked random households out of the British household panel survey and initialize the simulation with those big households, so that some of the historicity implicit in that data starts there. The second thing, because the social processes within the model only start at a certain point, you do have to run it for a bit, run it in. So there has to be a chance. So there's a chance for the history to be evolved inside the model. So there is a history inside the model going back to previous events, because that's crucial to a lot of the emergent tendencies and processes that come out of it. Understanding the model from the meso level does seem to be the most productive, as in it does seem to us from observing the model that the clustering within the model, how much people talk to, for example, people only of the same interest in politics themselves, or only talk to people who are interested in politics, other people don't talk to people who are only not interested in politics, and how much of that structure is affecting the model is one of the key questions we have. That's quite a complex situation to analyze because the model is a mess. There's all sorts of bits. Some people are talking to some others, but others not. And in a sense, that's what the physicist's job is to try and analyze and test that very specific hypothesis in this very specific and complex model. Did that answer all your questions? Some of it.
Some of it. Because again, if wait.
Sorry.
We get it around.
Well, I will try to remember what I want to say, but some of it, the last bit, let's say what you said, that the physicists are trying to see what are the particularities of that particular network that is actually more voting active, let's say, as opposed to the ones that are not voting active. But again, you have more particularities, more variables to link it with the previous presentation that you need to extract from that in order to be certain that you're actually addressing the group that you want to address in order to be able to then move up a level. When you're still at this micro context, let's say, you have people that they vote and you have people that they don't vote. People that they're still inclined to vote and people that they're not, right? But again, that particular network, according to context, has particular characteristics, let's say frequency of meeting. So what is the impact and what forms does this impact take from these active voters as opposed to these active voters? You connect it to migration historicity, that's why I wrote it in. How do these particular immigrant groups that are more embedded in society interact differently? So how do actually the physicists in this case extract this particular and decide what the factors are there before you move from the micro to the meso level.
Okay. Just what is not a fast one-to-one argument. So there are two ways of abstraction here. What the physicists are doing are not necessarily moving up from micro to meso. They're abstracting in general. So they will look at this model and they will chuck out all sorts of things in a typical physicist fashion that they think is irrelevant, and then try and do some maths and analyze the properties of simulation. So in a very sort of mundane way, in a sense, they're debugging the model because they're producing their own models of the model and checking it against the model and its understanding. What they're not necessarily doing is understanding it at any particular level of aggregation. So one of the advantages of this kind of model is any idea you have for understanding the meso level, you can start to look into the model and try and check it. So one thing one often does have to do is follow an individual agent through and see what's happened to it. In a sense, even though you've got it in a simulation, there's no quick trick to avoiding sometimes following individuals and understanding them. And only then, I'm doing that a lot of times, of course it's easier in a simulation than in real life, a lot easier, can you see if there's any patterns, and you might then think of what is important to their context, or what context did the family made a huge impact, or what context the friends made a bigger impact, etc. And whether they were new immigrants or anything like that, and you can start to see that. What we haven't had a chance to do is integrating particular stories of immigrants and things like that, and that's something I'd like to do, and we haven't done that yet. But in a way, the problem with this kind of technique is it's so open-ended as you can inspect it in any way you like. In a very similar way, well, not quite similar because you can't talk to them, but you can look inside their head to see what they're doing and why, and forming hypotheses. And often, at least in my observation, you do get this high contextuality. Some mechanisms are just really important under certain circumstances than others, or in the simulation. Of course, the physicists have the contrary. Physicists, but they'll be proved wrong, so that's okay.
Other questions? If there are no other questions, I'd like to ask one briefly. I see that you move, in your scheme, you move from data to different levels of models and different levels of abstraction. So I was wondering whether in your approach there's any possibility or any scope for moving back from the models to the data again if you find something in your simulation results or in your model that suggests that maybe you need more data or that maybe you need to look at more variables or re-interview people or something like that.
Yes, the high levels of abstraction often don't sort of allow you to predict in any simple-minded way the lower levels. So you can't, once you've climbed this thing, then look from a God point of view and then return everything. It doesn't quite work at that because at each level you've lost some information that are important in different ways. And so the higher level abstractions tend to give you good pictures of what's happening below, but only to one or two aspects and only to within one or two kinds of circumstances, parameter ranges. But what you say is absolutely true. It often points you to what to look at in the lower models. So the data integration model has pointed us to lack in our knowledge to look for more data, for more evidence, would actually fill in some of the blanks we found. And the high level models have pointed to perhaps problems in the complex simulations. So from the point of view of debugging and this cycle of looking for more evidence, it's been very useful.
Okay. Thank you very much. And we can now move on to our third presentation for this session. So please come in. So it's mapping networks through stories, an approach for studying the personal networks of British think tank researchers. and it's Jordan Soukias, is it?
Tchilingirian, it's fine.
Thank you, from the University of Cambridge.
Thank you very much. It's quite a funny talk to give today, seeing as I'm in a room, it's a nightmare scenario really, because I'm in a room of experts in the method that I'm using in my PhD, and we've also got representatives from the think tank here as well, and I'm talking about think tanks and their networks, so it's going to be quite, I expect some interesting questions. So just a little bit of background. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, and I study British think tanks and policy research institutions. And so think tanks as organisations have been on the rise throughout, well, really the term started to be used in America in the 1960s, and slowly it started to rise and globalise around the world until the 1990s, where you start to see organisations being called think tanks all around the world. And think tank research has been based around one core problem, and that problem is, what is a think tank? No one actually knows what it is. It's quite interesting to say that Bruce, his organisation or his institute is on the World Directory of Think Tanks.
It is?
So is the RSA, so is the Fabian Society, which is a British socialist organisation which was started in the 1800s. So is the case at the LSE. So what is a think tank? That's been the big question that has bugged think tank research. I'm interested in think tanks because they tell us something about intellectuals in contemporary society. They tell us about expertise in late modernity, perhaps the marginalisation of academics in public life. They tell us about changes in science or social science, and they also, the more elite theorists and conspiratorial people out there, might give us an idea about how private capital and money work in politics. But we have this problem. What is a think tank? When you have such diverse organisations, how do you study them? Very briefly, the way that the biggest breakthrough in think tank research has come from the work of Thomas Medvetz, who takes a relational approach, but his relational approach is very much in the Bourdieuian tradition. So he says, let's all look at the think tank as an organisation. The think tank is not it's not a typology, it's a topography, it's a space where various organisations come together, and this space is a space between fields. It's situated between the space, this is from Medvetz's work, it's situated between the space of the field of politics, the field of media, the field of academia, and the field of business. And what his study looks at is how this space has rose or crystallised in the States, and we can use this to maybe think about how this space is crystallised in other countries. And I think this is a great way of thinking about what a think tank is and what it means to be a think tank. So that's kind of what the space looks like. And just to give you an idea that, so at the end of the day, don't think of a think tank as an organisation. Think of it as a struggle to maintain a balance between being more entrepreneurial than a university, more political than a university, but more academic than a lobbying firm, and so on. It's always a struggle to keep these things going. And I think it's a really great way of thinking about it. But my interests lie in how these organisations make knowledge, and how they make the policy-relevant social science. The field approach is helpful, but it only gives a very general picture. It gives a very abstracted symbolic struggle based on what is a think tank. But are there other struggles that are going on inside that space? And how important is the question of what is a think tank to think tanks on a daily basis? So what other actors are at work? Medvetz's picture of the space of think tanks is very helpful, but it's very empty. There are no other actors in there, but surely there must be other actors in there. I'm on the qualitative side. I'm interested in how do these actors separate themselves from these parental fields that they're situated between. So my approach is based on something called a sociology of intellectual interventions. So this is based on the work of Gil Ale, who focuses on the networks that intellectuals are enrolled into the public sphere. So when they make a statement, how that is then taken up by other actors and dissipates throughout the public sphere. Patrick Bev, who's my supervisor, talks about positioning theory, has an interest in intellectual teams and wider, looser networks, which are both friendly and hostile, which give life to a debate. Both of these approaches focus on the products of an intellectual. Of an intellectual. So they'll look at art, they'll look at papers, they'll look at speeches. So this is the theoretical background. They both have a sort of actor networkish flavour to them, but they are not actor network theorists. They don't use any formal network analysis, so they use network more as a metaphor. So why do I find this helpful? Because when you go to an intellectual's publication or to their products, I think this is where you actually see where they situate themselves and where they situate other people in the space that the field that they're engaged in. And when we look at think tank publications, especially, we actually see that we actually see these several social worlds overlapping in this one document. So in a sense, it acts like a boundary object, so I'll just quickly get through that. But what do I mean? So here's a typical think tank publication, the Social Market Foundation. So you go on the first 2 pages, you have the title, the organisation, you have the funder. So we have business field is represented there. We go to the acknowledgement sections, we have academics, we have civil servants, so politics, the field of academic production is also there, other research institutes, be they private organisations or other think tanks, colleagues, and then we have information about the author. So my PhD has been using this information to trace the connections between 30 think tanks and using acknowledgements, co-authorship and funding to trace the changing networks from 2005 to 2012. So I'm looking at how the relationships, how the people that are acknowledged, the people that fund the research and the people that author the research, how this changes over time. And I'm interested in who the central, especially in the advice network, who holds an interesting position in a network, in a network understanding what might be interesting, who brokers, who coordinates, who is central, those types of questions. But I'm also interested in the qualitative information because a publication at the end of the day is not a true network. In many ways, a publication is like a CV, whether that's on a wall, that's all about a scientific CV or an academic CV. So those names that I'm looking at, yes, they're helpful, yes, they give me an idea of the people that are in the network, but you're not going to put, or some people put all their interns, some people put all the helpful administrative staff, some people even put random people in when I've been trying to clean the data and work out who they're including in the network, some people are very generous and tell you everyone that's helped in their publication. Other people give you a very small amount of information, only the relevant people. So other people that use a similar approach, so people who look at the stocking directorships of think tanks, have always found that there's going to be more people involved in these networks than the directorship networks tell them. So they've encountered the same problem as me. And also, the quantitative maps, though interested, can tell me that someone will be central in the network or important, or we can assume might be important. It doesn't tell me about the dynamic process that goes on inside the researcher in the think tank. And I think that's important because not every think tank researcher is an expert. So some of my interviewees, I was talking about how they go about doing their research. And they would start off by saying, well, it's funny, I've only got a master's in theology, but I'm writing about housing policy. So how does someone like that, what's the process that they have to go through to make that knowledge? And that's where a more qualitative personal network approach was taken. I did try a more typical name generator interview, personal network interview with my interviewees. That failed in my financing attempt. I only had an hour with some of these people, and so some of the responses there, luckily one of the people was a friend, the first person, they said it was a terrible experience. So I then decided that I should probably not go for a typical name generating interview with these people. So what did I decide to do instead? Well, I decided to go for stories. So take should have copy of one. So actually go and interview the researchers with a copy of their report, and then ask them just to tell me the story of this report. How did it happen? Ask them about the inspiration, and just where did the idea for this come from? Where did the money for this come from? Tell me about it. So we already had a list of names in the acknowledgement section. We already knew who the funder was, and from that we could just take the story forward, and then they could tell me about the interactions between these different characters and the other people that weren't mentioned in the acknowledgement section. So these are the 3 stages that I went through in the interviews. Dissemination was particularly important, and hopefully there'll be time to tell you about that at the end. I also took along a personal network map, and you can sort of see it's a bit too pale. That was just to put in front of them, it's to jog their memories about the different types of professions or organisations they would have engaged with. So we've got journalists, business people, other think tanks, research institutes, civil society groups and so on, and there was, doesn't say on there was also, I think on some of them there was also a box saying others, where people could, it was just a, it wasn't in the same way some of the maps that we've seen this morning, it wasn't meant to be used like that, it was just made that people could write down and remember different people different people they've interacted with. It's also quite interesting, it was quite how people would, you know, pick it up and put it away again throughout the course of the interview, and when tell me about people they didn't get along with, you know, really underlining who really annoyed them, but they are important in the network because they may have annoyed them so much, they were very helpful in generating a new idea. So it was quite a useful tool to pick up that type of information. And actually interviewees were quite happy to spend some time. So whereas people were very reluctant to spend an hour going through who have you spoken to in the last 6 months, who do you turn to for X, Y, and Z, people were more than happy to go through the story and would spend 45 minutes to an hour. Some people, one person even spent 1 hour 45 minutes. I also found that this type of interview worked well with both junior researchers and the more senior, so the very people at the top of the organisations, like the Matthew Taylors of this world. And so I got these qualitative stories, but I also got what could be quantifiable data. Some people gave me 5 alters, and others gave me 50. And at the end of the interview, there was enough time to sort of say, can you just tell me about who knows who in this network, so we could get an idea about basic structure. And some interviewees have even allowed me to come back with some more traditional structured questions about tie strength and so on. So there might be some space to, not for the PhD just running out of time, but maybe this method could be a way of trying to get some quantifiable data rather than just stories. Okay, so just say that the differences between the networks that were generated. It was quite interesting that some of the organisations that I was studying in the whole network have very small networks, and they seem quite isolated from the rest of the network, that's because, one, they're small organisations and they only produce 13 publications, whereas a large organisation might do 50 publications a year. So their advice networks will look smaller on the map. But it's also quite interesting interviewing the smaller organisations compared to the larger organisations, actually seeing that that was more of a strategy. They have a smaller network because rather than having a staff of people who aren't experts, who don't have masters in theology and are looking at housing policy, they actually bring the expert on housing policy in. So their networks are going through much more. So it was quite helpful in clarifying why the networks were different. And just a selection of findings. I think the most interesting thing to say in the last couple of minutes is to actually see the drama of the network, the drama of research taking place in some of these organisations. Now, because think tanks are so diverse, the themes there are some sort of general themes to the population that I was studying, but you can really see the difference in the culture of these organisations. So the more academic organisations, they weren't courting politicians, and they weren't needing to find experts, whereas the more political organisations were needing to find academics to give them quick bits of information. But the way they used these networks, these contacts, were quite different. So the way a political think tank research would go to a this is probably a good example. So the way a political think tank work would go to an academic would be to in a quite combative way, actually. So, as this quote implies, they're not going there to learn; they're going there to clarify. Whereas whereas more academic people might, the more academic networks were about discussing. This was saying, no, I've got 5 points that I need to clarify quickly. Who can help me with that? And then they find that an academic could give them a brief overview of the whole field that they're interested in. They could take the key points that they need, then go away and write and start writing their reports, and then get that okayed by their colleagues. I'm not saying that's the case in every think tank, but it did seem to be a theme. There was this sort of the way that their networks could quickly link them to a very expert community. They could get a taste, an idea, run away from that community, and feel expert enough to carry on and to make an intervention into the public sphere. So what does that mean about the types of ties? I'm sort of rushing quite a bit. I like to think of the ties of think tank workers as partial connections. These ties aren't there to bring people into a different community. They're there to take them close enough, but to never fully immerse themselves in that community. And I think that's a strategic thing. It's a necessary thing, because the whole point about being a think tank is, if you let those ties solidify for too long, you become illegitimate. You take yourself out of the space of think tanks. You get enrolled into the life of academia. You become too political, and no one wants to talk to you anymore because you've lost your legitimacy. So it's very important that these partial connections are maintained, but you don't want to fall into that. You don't want them to drag you into another community. And just finally, the network, though, can be a source of information. It can be a source of it's something that can help it's something that it brings benefits to the organisation in money, in ideas. It's also a site of danger, partly for the reasons that I said before. So I think a very good example of that would be obviously the funders. If you're seen as being parroting your funders line, too closely associated with that, therefore you lose your legitimacy. But think tanks spend a lot of time trying their best not to be enrolled by other groups. But sometimes that just happens by completely out of their own control. So, for example, you can write a publication, you can do all the right work, you can find all the right experts, you can go to all the right politicians, you can do everything right. But once you've written that publication, it then goes out into the public sphere, and then other people can take your work and reposition you. And you get enrolled in another group's network, and another group's ideas, and another group's battle, and that adds to it. And you wouldn't have got that information from a general network interview. So having that focus on the story of the network really showed how, even though we could have the personal network of the researcher, actually there was another network that was drawing on the researcher's work, which they weren't part of, they had no connections to whatsoever, and was having an effect on their labour. Does that make sense? Or does that make okay.
So, questions?
Thank you. That's very interesting. I really find it also very informative from my own research when I spoke before. Could you go back to the slide where you have all the different fields from the beginning? Yes, yeah. So I was wondering, do you have from your research, did anything emerge how you could, that is kind of evidence for kind of to make it legitimate that the think tanks are kind of like a separate field, or is it more a conflation of all the other fields, or how would you, based on your findings, how would you locate the field of, or can you even speak of the field of the think tanks or not, or yeah?
I wouldn't say that it depends what day it is. I've still got a couple of months before I have to make a definite decision on it. Is there a field of think tanks? Well, field as a concept is something that you use to, they don't exist, they're not naturally existing things, it's something that we as researchers place on the community. But does the space of think tank exist? The way I see it is that a lot of these organisations, they come from their home fields, so you know who the academic ones are. But the interesting thing is actually how they mix in the middle. So I mean, I've still got to have the sort of concentrated time of quantitative analysis. But what you can sort of see is that funding networks seem to be quite different. The network, there's a clear left-right split. But then when you look at the advisory networks actually show there's a very core clump of left and right-wing think tanks using the same sources of information, the same academics, and the same institutions. So, in certain ways, yes, there are. You can speak of a field, or you can speak of an institutional space, but at the same time, it's still very weakly institutional, and it's still split amongst them. And you have some organisations which just won't interact with the other organisations. They will not share the same funders because they only work with the civil service. They don't care about politicians. They only care about winning large research contracts and working with universities. Symbolically, yes, we can think of it, but on an interaction level, I would less so, but on a symbolic level, these diverse organisations are still playing a very similar game.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wondered how you sampled the think tanks that you spoke to, and also how you managed to achieve the temporal aspect you spoke about at the beginning, I think, just by doing the interview based on one report, I think it was by a think tank, or, yeah, I was just interested how that worked. Thank you.
So that might be me rushing. What I meant is that, so I spent some time, a very long time actually, sitting down and going through each public think tank publication from 2005 to 2012, and cutting and pasting and saying, this is the funder network, this is the advice network, this is the co-authorship network. So that was one bit of that. And the way I sampled those think tanks, I said I looked at generally looking at social policy. So I decided not to look at health, I decided not to look at defence, I decided not to look at international development, and then from that, I said, so that cut down the amount of organisations that I could look at. And then on top of that, I looked at, I said only organisations that were active from 2005, so that cut out some of the newer think tanks like Res Publica or the Resolution Foundation, who would have been very interesting to keep in, but unfortunately I couldn't. Because there was just been far too much information to go through. And then also I went to checked media, also talked to people in the think tank world in the first year of my the first year of my study, just to sort of get an idea about who they saw the different actors, who they saw their competitors as being, who might need to be included, and who are the key players from their perspective, just to get an idea to check that my sample matched names that they knew, because, like you say, I could have put Bruce's organisation in, but I don't know how many of the the hardcore think tankers would have seen him as a think tank. And the interviews were separate; they were just there to get an idea. I picked one publication that I contacted the interviewee, said, "Can we talk about a publication that you worked on in the last year?" And asked them to choose a typical publication, not one that was particularly bad or particularly good, just one that represents your work. And then from that, going through that story, we could then look at, maybe compare what a bad project looks like and what a good project looks like.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, so we have two.
You talked a lot about how the narrative informed you, your narrative understanding from these stories. But you also implied that you did do a more traditional sort of social network analysis from the authors and the funding network and everything like that. Could you maybe talk a bit about what you learnt from each and how one informed the others?
So I take the other question too.
Okay,
okay, so that's fine. So that's fine.
I'll have to say that I've only really looked at the funding data in any detail, so I'm still doing the quantitative side. So really, I'm treating these interviews as a general comment about what it's like to do research in this space. So at this stage, I can't sort of say how to are.
Has the qualitative stuff informed your social network?
I'm probably going to say, in the sense that it informed in the sense that I realised that I wasn't going to answer all the interesting questions just through the quantitative data. So it made me think that it's important to have in-depth interviews about their perception of that network or a snapshot of that network. But it can't tell me exactly it can't comment on all the different time periods. It can only talk about what it's like to be in this sort of space where you're having to call on different types of professions in your network. But it can't tell me, you can't really use the qualitative data to triangulate exactly what that time meant between the LSE and the Fabian Society in 2005 and why it wasn't restarted in 2007. It just wasn't that type of interview. Some of the interviewees weren't senior enough for that. If I focus more on, say, the directors of the think tanks, which is more of a, I think that's something I'm going to do post, that's something I'd like to do post the PhDs to look at the people who've been in the network long enough, who are usually at the director level, to see their view of how it's changed and their narrative about the actual complete network rather than just the present network.
Right, any last questions for this presenter? Okay, so thank you very much.